Noswathar. Good evening and Christ. Welcome to the March talk of the Penman Historical Society and Museum. It's lovely to have such a great crowd here this evening. I seem to be losing my voice. I don't have a sore throat or anything. I must have been yelling too much at the rugby match recently. It didn't do much good. Before we start, could I just ask you all to mute your phones? And I'll wait for you to do that. But if there's an emergency and we need to get out of this building, if it's coming from that direction, then we need to come this way, through the ladies' toilets here, and down the fire escape at the back. Otherwise, we will, if it's a descent, then we go out the way we came in. I just want to update you on progress in the museum. When I say we're nearly there, that's very optimistic, but we will be opening on the 3rd of April. And I don't know if any of you know, we want to bring back the model of the hill fort that Ivor Davis created. It's been in Cardiff in the museum and in their store all these years. Well, we now want to bring it back to Penman Mount, where it started out, and we've created a little area for it, but it's taken a lot of work. We're not quite there yet, but we will be opening, come hell or high water, on the 3rd of April. What else did I have to tell you? I think that's all. We've just got another few people arriving, so we'll wait till they make themselves comfortable before I introduce George to you. You see, I told you lots of people.
Hello, nice.
Around here. The gentleman's just in the top. I hope you've all had a chance to buy the raffle tickets. There's lovely prizes. Not to be missed. And have I told you yet about the shop that supports the museum that we have in Penman Mawr, up on the corner by the traffic lights? It's a wonderful little place. If you need the odd birthday card, birthday gift. I hope my voice doesn't break down before the end of the day. There we are. Okay, I have great pleasure introducing George Higgins, who's in his final year of his PhD research. He's a student at Bangor University researching the social and cultural history of mountaineering in Mountaineering National Park in the 20th century, sorry.
It's okay.
He is also a Wales Regional Ambassador for History Lab Plus at the Institute of Historical Research. I haven't heard of that one. His talk details the history and heritage of Irregular mountaineering, covering topics often overlooked in general histories and heritage presentations of the area. Welcome, George.
Thank you very much. Okay, so can everybody hear me okay? Brilliant. All right, so good evening, Diolch yn fawr. Thanks for everybody attending, and obviously thank you to Penman Mawr Museum for the invitation. It's actually a pleasure to be here in this location specifically to deliver this talk. That's because a lot of the stories that I'll talk about in this presentation and a lot of the people and organisations that I'll talk about would have passed through this area and often stayed in this area and explored this area, with the North Wales coast being a sort of gateway into the mountains, and obviously we can see the mountains from here. So yeah, the perfect location really to discuss the topic. I'll try not to drone on too much. I'm aware it's an evening talk, so I don't want to bore people to death, but I'm hoping really that we could have a bit of time at the end for questions and potentially have even a bit of a discussion going, especially if anything that I talk about connects with anyone's sort of personal stories. Obviously, it's the history that's really rooted in this area, so if anyone has any sort of anecdotes, stories, things like that, please feel free to share them. And I do have about an hour before I have to get my train, so if there's any stories that potentially extend to the pub, then that's absolutely fine by me. Okay. So it's a bit tricky deciding where to begin with the story of mountaineering in Eddie. I think calling the speech the history of mountaineering in Eddie is probably a bit ambitious because it's huge in scope. People have technically gone up mountains for a very long time, but if we're talking about mountaineering and rock climbing in a modern sense, often the conventional starting point is Reverend William Bingley and Peter Williams. So they ascended Cloggin y Garneth in 1798. This is widely regarded as the first recorded rock climb in Wales. It's not really a concrete fact, and it is somewhat open to interpretation. I think the argument there is that it was technically a rock climb, and in the way that it was described by Bingley, can sort of be interpreted as a rock climb. But Bingley wasn't a climber or a mountaineer as we understand in the modern sense. He was a naturalist, so he was someone who happened to encounter steep ground in his pursuit of botany, rather than actively saying, oh, look at that over there, or that there, and saying, I think I'd like to try and climb that. But yeah, that's the conventional starting point to sort of say, this is where climbing, mountaineering, and again, those terms can be kind of interchangeable. There may be people in this room that have their own perspectives on what mountaineering means, what climbing means, stuff like that, but I'll keep it relatively open and general for this conversation. So another really key area especially in the sort of Victorian story and Edwardian story of mountaineering in Eddie is Llyweth. So this is the great cliff on the side of Snowdon which overlooks Llyn Llydau. It was the first major Welsh crag to be systematically explored. So there's lots of routes recorded up there. People started to grade those routes, started to talk about how difficult they were, what they experienced, and how they actually got up there, essentially. So, for example, in 1883, the brothers A.H. and A.W. Stocker climbed what became known as the Slanting Gully. So this is among one of the earliest recorded technical rock climbing routes in Eddie. Through the 1890s and 1900s, we have figures like J.M. Archer-Thompson and A.W. Andrews, who documented dozens of routes and climbs in the area. And as you can see, possibly can see, it looks a bit small now, but that is a guidebook that they produced, which is widely regarded, and I'd say pretty much is the first actual climbing guidebook to be published on climbing in Wales. So that was published by the Climbers Club in 1909. So this documentation, really, this recording the routes, grading them, this is what transforms scrambling up the rocks and going up the rocks, in my opinion, into a climbing culture. So we have routes named, graded, and in this context and time period, also recorded in English by visitors and in journals that are circulated, particularly in this time, by urban professionals who are outside of the area, visiting the area and recording these sort of expeditions that they were having. So writing these climbs is a crucial act, really. It creates a sort of shared canon of mountaineering, and that's why I sort of interpret that as mountaineering culture. So I do need to do a bit of a disclaimer now, because I'm going to absolutely butcher the pronunciation of this place. The Gorfwisva Hotel at Penny Pass, I know that was horrible, but I do apologise, was run by Owen Rawson Owen, and it became the social birthplace of Welsh climbing. So the Easter meets here from the 1890s became legendary. There were communal dinners, sing-songs, speeches, and sometimes amateur theatricals. Figures like Oscar Eckenstein, some people might have heard that name if they're familiar with mountaineering history, and the Abraham brothers, George and Ashley Abraham, were also pioneering mountain photographers at the time. And then later, someone who I'll talk about very shortly, Geoffrey Winthrop Young, all gathered here. These were not just casual get-togethers, but they were carefully curated events, and invitation to these events mattered. This is where climbing became a community, not just an activity, and where the social hierarchies that would define it for the subsequent decades were established. So one person I want to talk about specifically, and I will say that there are a lot of individuals that I could talk about, and there could be hours and hours. That's why I'm doing a PhD thesis on the topic. But one person I think it's important to mention is Geoffrey Winthrop Young. So he was an Eton schoolmaster, a war poet, an educational reformer, and he was a formidable alpine and Welsh climber. So major routes on Llywelyn and in the Alps, he'd achieved these before 1914. He lost his leg below the knee at Ypres in 1917, but he continued climbing with a prosthetic. He ascended the Matterhorn after this in 1928. He was someone who presided over the meets that I just talked about in Penny Pass. He shaped the entire social culture of this era through force of personality. And the guest list of these events tells you everything. George Mallory was a regular here, alongside academics, barristers, civil servants, and other sort of professional elites of the time. So they were profoundly exclusive. Young established a pattern, a self-selecting social network with gatekeepers who determined who was welcome. The mountains were technically open to everybody, but this culture surrounding them in this period of time wasn't open to everyone. So, the pre-war era of mountaineering in Erie, when I say pre-war, I'm kind of generalising a bit as before World War II, which is probably what I should have wrote. This is a time where we start to see the development of a formalisation of mountaineering and climbing in the area. So we see different institutions kind of cementing themselves during this period, which includes mountaineering clubs and the associated publications that come with that. So we've got journals and guidebooks, and also a physical establishment of this culture through climbing huts, where we have often disused farm buildings that start to be adopted by these clubs and used for them to travel when they're climbing in the area. So the most significant club in the area is the Climbers Club. So this was founded in London in 1898. It is widely regarded as the sort of oldest climbing club in Britain. Now, there are older clubs like the Alpine Club, but people regard this as like the oldest climbing-focused club, if that makes sense. So it was formed by a group including figures like Charles Pilkington and W.P. Haskett Smith. The club's journal is the authoritative record of the early era and continuing into the 20th century era of mountaineering in Eddie. You can see things within these journals such as new route descriptions, ethical debates on climbing and practices, and also another thing that was born out of these journals were the guidebooks that were published by the Climbers Club, which were sort of the definitive and often still are regarded as the definitive guidebooks to climbing in Eddie. The Climbers Club published the first comprehensive Cwm Idwal guide in 1936 and also the definitive Clogging Dir Arthi guide. Controlling the guidebooks was sort of controlling the narrative of climbing in the area. So which routes were important, how they were graded, and what was considered significant to climbing culture in the area. But on a different note, especially the early journals are also a document of exclusion. So the default voice of these early journals is educated, male and English, and women appear rarely. So this is not to be controversial, but it leads into my next slide, which is the Pinnacle Club. So in 1921, Emily Pat Kelly, Pat is the nickname as she was known to her friends, founded the Pinnacle Club at the Pennygird Hotel with fellow climbers including Mrs. Eden Smith and Mrs. Steele. Pat Kelly was a factory worker from Macclesfield who climbed at an exceptionally high standard for the era. She led severe grade routes, and obviously to people who don't climb that might not mean much, but essentially she was very good at rock climbing. At a time when most women were confined to easier grades and which were conducted often under male supervision. So this act of forming the Pinnacle Club was a direct response to the exclusion that I mentioned previously with the Climbers Club. So the Climbers Club didn't admit women as full members of the club until 1975. The constitution of the Pinnacle Club required that members lead climbs, which is a quietly radical requirement since the convention of the time was that women would follow on a man's rope during climbing. So in this sense, leading the climbs also equaled autonomy for the women members of the Pinnacle Club. And also leading on things like decision making and also accepting their own personal risk. Pat Kelly was sadly killed in a fall on the North Buttress of Trivan in Easter 1922, just a year after she founded the Pinnacle Club. She was descending from the summit in poor conditions, but the club survived. It got its own hut at Cwm Aigyaw in 1938 and it produced its own journal and generated generations of accomplished climbers, including names such as Nia Morin and Gwen Moffat, who became Britain's first female mountain guide. So this is a sort of parallel world to this mainstream narrative of mountaineering in Eddie during this time period. So, another really interesting character that I wanted to discuss in relation to climbing in Eddie is Colin Kirkus. So he was a Liverpool insurance clerk and an outstanding climber of his generation. His first ascent of the Great Slab on Cloghingdir Arthi in 1930 with A.B. Hargreaves was a breakthrough. And to kind of paint a picture for people who aren't familiar with climbing, it's a long exposed route on possibly the most intimidating cliff in Wales. Some people might argue with that. And he followed this up with routes like the Chimney Route and also Birthday Crack. Kirkus also climbed extensively in the Alps, and he wrote the first Gliddervac guidebook. Sadly, he was killed in action over Bremen in 1942, aged just 32, which, sadly for the story of pre-World War II climbing, is very familiar, as a lot of really talented climbers were killed in action during World War I and also during World War II. He served as a navigator in Bomber Command. Cloghingdir Arthi, or Cloggy, as people who are familiar with the rock face will generally know it. It is worth sort of pondering for a moment what it actually looks like or feels like being in that environment. So this is a 600-foot cliff on the north side of Islwitha, and it's arguably the most important single crag in British climbing history. Generations of the best climbers tested themselves here, and Colin was one of the key pioneers, especially during the pre-war period of climbing on this cliff. So another really important figure I want to talk about is John Menlove Edwards. So he was a Liverpool-born psychiatrist and a powerful and unconventional climber. He was also a gay man in an era where this was criminalised. He put up over 100 new routes in North Wales. Many of them were on the Llanberis Cliffs and the Three Cliffs, which are generally known as Cloggy, Dinas Mott and Dinas Cromlech. So we have routes like Brant in 1931 and the Direct on the west buttress of Cloggy. And to put it in context, basically these were miles ahead of their time relative to the standards of that period. But I'd argue that it's his writing that sets him apart from his contemporaries. His guidebook descriptions and essays are psychologically intense. They are also philosophically searching, and at times they're a bit more like modernist prose than route records. His essay titled Scenery for a Murder reads nothing like any other climbing literature of the period. I know to a lot of people they won't know what these things are, but I'm just sort of giving examples if people want to sort of look into these later. He was also a conscientious objector in the war, which was another aspect of him which marginalised him from the mainstream at the time. Sadly, he took his own life in 1958 by cyanide poisoning, and his story kind of draws attention to questions about how much this era's community, the climbing community of masculine camaraderie, was able to accommodate people like John and their differences. So obviously following before the war, we have after the war. There is obviously the war itself, i.e. World War II, but for the sort of time frames, I won't go into too much detail about the wartime period. Essentially, like I mentioned, a lot of climbers were in the war and also sadly lost their lives in that war. So the post-war period is really where a lot of my research focuses on. Obviously, in the wider context of Wales and Britain and basically the world at the time, everything changed after 1945. So for mountaineering in Eryri specifically, we have things like ex-servicemen bringing bringing a different sort of attitude to climbing. So oftentimes a greater confidence and also an impatience with the sort of deference that we see with this old guard of mountaineering. Also, we have things in the much broader context like the welfare state, which creates conditions for broader participation. So people have paid holidays, better transportation, and we also see the rise of things like youth hostels during this period. But the real revolution in climbing during this period, I'd argue, came from Manchester, which is roughly where I'm from. Specifically, a duo of working class climbers who basically, whether they made it their mission or not explicitly, shattered the old order of climbing in Eddie. So the first person that I want to talk about is someone that even people who don't have an extensive knowledge of climbing, mountaineering in Eddie probably at least maybe have heard of this person at some point, just by nature of being in Eddie. So the first person that I want to talk about is Joe Brown. So he grew up in poverty in Ardwick in Manchester. And when I say poverty, at the time Ardwick was literally referred to as a slum. So we kind of get the picture of the type of place that he was coming from. He left school at 14 and became a builder and a plumber. He learned to climb on the gritstone of the Peak District, and he arrived in Eddie by the late 1940s. To what we've just discussed earlier about the early and pre-war mountaineering, he was an outsider in every sense. He was the wrong class, and he was the wrong accent, which I don't know if I have much of a strong accent from that area anymore because I've lived in Wales for the last 10 years, but would be maybe somewhat like my accent. So two people within the climbing community, if you throw out names like Cenotaph Corner and Dinas Cromlech, this is like the sort of gold standard of climbing in Eddie, and Joe Brown was the person who was sort of pushing that standard. So Cenotaph Corner was a really fierce overhanging crack. There's a picture of it there. As you can see, it is quite difficult to get up that. It was literally, well, not literally, but it can be described as a quantum leap in the standards of climbing during this period. And just to put it in context, there was essentially not many people at all that were able to challenge the routes that Joe Brown put up during the 1950s. So these were routes on Cloggy. He kind of picked up where the people had left off and sadly died in the pre-war era, and put down routes such as the Black Cleft, Vember and the Grooves, which again, these are just names to people that aren't familiar with climbing. But they're even now regarded within those communities, and often people will refer back to Joe Brown when they talk about these routes. I could probably make a whole presentation on Joe Brown. He's a very interesting figure. There's lots of books about him, so if anyone's interested in learning more about him, it's quite easy to access material on him. So there's quite an unflattering photo on here of the next figure, who is Don Willans. The reason I put the photo on the left up there is because it kind of describes the contrast between Don and Joe Brown. So Don Willans was essentially Joe Brown's partner in crime during the 1950s sort of spree of high standards, pushing the standard climbing that took place in this period. He grew up in Salford in a very similar sort of upbringing to Joe Brown. He was also a plumber like Brown, but he was basically the opposite in temperament. He was quite short and stocky. He was very combative and also described as very funny and famously blunt. Stories about Don Willans are essentially a genre in of themselves. There are lots of them, and maybe some of them are true. But he was an outstanding climber in his own right. He made the first ascent of Slanting Slab on Cloggy, which he was partnered with Joe Brown, and later the first British ascent of the southwest pillar of the Drupe in the Alps. Together, Don and Joe were responsible with some other individuals for forming the Rock and Ice Club in 1951 at a pub in Manchester. So these were working class climbers from the terrace streets of Manchester. They bivouacked under boulders at Cromlech because they couldn't get access to the mountaineering huts that I described earlier. They often hitchhiked to Wales on the weekends. It was an affront to the established gentlemanly traditions of early climbing in Erie. And the mainstream journals of mountaineering during this time had a sort of coded discomfort within them. You can read between the lines of a sort of anxiety about standards. And when I say standards, I don't mean standards of climbing, but social standards. So there was a democratization of climbing that was happening, and essentially a bit of a class-based moral panic that ensued within this culture of mountaineering in Erie. So another thing I want to discuss as well, that might be a building that is familiar to people who drive through Erie or people who maybe even shop there because it's still open, I think. In 1966, Joe Brown opened up an outdoor equipment shop in Capel-Currig, the one pictured behind me. This was in the old Pinnacle Cafe building on the A5 road. He also later opened a second shop in Llanberis, which again, I'm probably sure people are familiar with. This is quite an important milestone in the culture of climbing in Erie because it's not just about commerce, it's a different sort of relationship with the local economy. It represents a broader trend of climbers putting down roots in the area, and in Brown's case, becoming employers, paying business rates. In the pre-war era, equipment was improvised, and things like plimsolls, hemp rope, ex-army carabiners. By the 1960s, a specialist industry had emerged. We had brands like Troll, which was founded by Willans and had famous Willans harness. And DMM is another company that was established in Llanberis, and later many other companies. The climbing shop became a social hub. Information was exchanged, advice was given to newcomers. It was a place where the climbing community intersected with a tourist economy. Joe himself would have been behind the counter up until the 1990s, and he was a living link between that 1950s revolution in climbing that we discussed and the mass outdoor culture that succeeded it during the later 20th century and up until now. So another really important hub for the culture of mountaineering in Erie, and another place that was really important to this sort of democratization of climbing is the Plasy Brenin Outdoor Centre. This picture is, I'm not sure on the precise date off the top of my head, I think it's roughly late 50s or 60s. But Plasy Brenin was opened in a former Victorian hotel in Capel-Currig. They originally opened as the National Mountain Centre in 1955, and it was run by the Central Council of Physical Recreation. John Disley, an Olympic steeplechaser and co-founder of the London Marathon, was an early director of the centre. So in the context of this, climbing could now be formally taught and certified. Previously, you needed connections to individuals or clubs to access the knowledge of climbing and the different standards and routes that were being achieved. Outdoor education centres bypassed this. So we have school groups, youth organisations, without the necessity for this connection. Local authority centres proliferated across Eryri during this time period, had places like Towers in Capel Curig and Ogwyn Cottage just up the road, and many others that I could list off. This was arguably the most effective democratisation of mountain access in Eryri in the 20th century. But there was some sort of debate within the wider culture of mountaineering about whether formalisation of the sport would destroy the adventure of it and the self-reliance that made mountaineering and rock climbing distinctive from other activities. So another really important topic that I wanted to discuss, I know I've said all of it is really important, but this is particularly important, is there is a sense that you will get from the narrative of climbing in Eryri, and also sometimes from within narratives on Welsh history as well, that climbing was purely a pastime that was conducted by people who visited from England. It certainly was predominantly that, and I wouldn't argue that it was not predominantly that, but there are cases where it was very much taken up by the local community and also a Welsh language community. So as the name I mentioned there, Robert Mervyn Jones, he wrote an article. I won't go into massive detail of it because it's quite a long journal article, but essentially he talks about a sense of Welsh indifference towards the mountain environment. So people who live in areas like Penmaen Mawr and also deeper into Eryri, he looks at a perspective of sources like poetry and other sort of Welsh language sources, and sort of deducts that on the whole people weren't particularly not interested in the mountains, but didn't have this sort of affection for them that people who visited the area might express. So what I'm going to do now is just discuss some individuals and also an example of an organised sort of Welsh language focused mountaineering club. So one person that probably appears as the primary Welsh language voice in mountaineering in Eryri is Ioan Bawn Rhys. He was a local politician, a solicitor. He was chief executive of Gwynedd County Council, and he was a committed Welsh language activist. And on top of that, he was also an avid mountaineer. He wrote the books that are on the screen there. They can be quite hard to get hold of. I managed to get copies of them after searching for a while. The one on the end, which is more of a poetry collection, is a little bit easier to get hold of, but the two Welsh language books are a bit trickier. But there are copies at Bangor University if anyone's interested. So yeah, these are among the very few Welsh language mountaineering books of the area of the era. They're really distinct because they're not translations of original English works. The original first Welsh language works. And I believe for both Galwad I Mynydd and Dringo Mynyddoedd Cymru, there aren't English copies of them, basically. This made a deliberate claim that the Welsh-speaking community's relationship with the mountains was deeper and older than the English recreational tradition, and this was something that Johan Baum-Rees liked to make a point of. He argued that Welsh speakers should reclaim the landscape from a sort of imported culture. So this raises the question, in a way, of when it comes to the mountains, whose knowledge counts? Is it the climber who knows Cenotaph Corner and every hold on the rock face? Or is it the farming family that lives below Dinas Cromlech? There's also a place name question which crystallises this point. The recent formal adoption of Eryri and Irwyddfa as the default of formal place names in the area are kind of the culmination of these arguments that Baum-Rees was making back in the sort of mid 20th century. Another really interesting figure in Welsh mountaineering is Eric Jones. I don't know if anyone has heard of him, but he's definitely worth looking into if you're interested in the topic. He was from a Welsh-speaking area. He was the son of a quarryman, and he became one of the most accomplished British climbers of the 60s and 70s, and also into the 1980s as well. So his specific type of climbing that he pioneered was soloing. So obviously, I don't know if people have seen recent things about Alex Honnold, who's just free soloing. It's very popular to audiences now, but Eric Jones was one of the people that was kind of pioneering this way back in the 60s, 70s and 80s. He made a solo ascent of the north face of the Eiger, which was filmed by Leo Dickinson, and also a solo ascent of the north face of the Matterhorn. Closer to home, he was a prolific route developer at Tremadog and Craig I'r Isfa. He also ran what is a legendary cafe, which people might be familiar, which is the Tre Cafe at Tremadog for years. It's not open anymore, but this was a gathering point for the Eryri climbing community. Jones is really important in this context because he's a Welsh-speaking climber and he's operating at the very highest level of the sport during this time period. And for people that are interested in other sort of adrenaline-fueled sports, he was also a big skydiving enthusiast and was one of the early people pioneering base jumping, which is frankly terrifying. So that's Charles Evans. He's another individual that is not necessarily overlooked, but his story isn't necessarily told as a story that is Welsh heritage. So he was brought up by a Welsh family, and he was a really key figure in the 1953 ascent of Everest. I'm conscious I want to leave a bit of time for questions, so I only have a couple of bits left. So Club Dringo and Porthmadog is an example of a organised Welsh-speaking mountaineering club. So the book on the screen there is kind of an overall history of the club. It's really interesting, and another great example of the local Welsh community being involved with mountaineering. So the last section I'm going to talk about is mountain rescue in Eryri. So mountain rescue basically started with the RAF's presence in Eryri. So they brought with them different techniques and a more sort of formalised and organised approach to mountain rescue, where previously if you had an accident in the mountains or some sort of is described as misadventure, is the way that it was generally put. It was kind of up to whoever was around to help you, which is quite a scary thought, really. There are some books there on the screen that are kind of like amateur history books that detail this story. They're really interesting, and it shows how Eridie is actually one of the key mountain rescue sort of developers within the British context. It's certainly been the busiest area for mountain rescues throughout the 20th century. That's a picture from Ogwen Valley Mountain Rescue Organisation. I believe it's rescue in the 1960s. There's a great page on their website that details the history of Ogwen Valley Mountain Rescue. And obviously there's other mountain rescue organisations in Eridie as well, like Llanberis and Aberglaslyn. So yeah, the last thing I wanted to just discuss, if anyone's interested in sort of following any of the threads that I've discussed, obviously there's a lot to cover, and I've tried to look at a few different stories, but these are some good starting points in terms of source material. So there's a couple of books there. Rock Climbers in Action in Snowdonia is a really good book, with some great writing and some great photography as well, which was quite pioneering for the time, which covers that 1950s period, and it was sort of globally renowned as a really great book beyond the sort of climbing community. Those books can be really expensive and really hard to get hold of because there's quite a tight-knit community of people who, including myself, who collect these books and also sort of collect the history of mountaineering. But there are copies of them at Bangor University, so if you don't want to pay like, I don't know, £150 for a book, which is a lot for an old book, there is a great collection at Bangor University, the Climbers Club collection. There's lots of books, lots of journals. If you are interested in pursuing that research, that's a really great place to start. And there's some other organisations. Mountain Heritage Trust in Keswick, in the Lake District, they have a really unique collection. So they have a mix of sort of letters from people like Chris Bonington. They have a lot of early mountaineering equipment, and again, very welcoming to people who like to research that history. So yeah, hopefully there's a bit of time for some questions. I went slightly longer than I was supposed to, but...
Thank you, George. That's very interesting. And thank you for giving us these reference points.
That's okay.
To follow up if we're interested. Lovely. Does anyone have any questions for George, please? Or have any?
Yeah.
I think you should include Griff Pugh in your list of prominent people as well. He was on the 1953 expedition to Everest, and he was highly significant because he was the doctor on the expedition. And if it hadn't been for the doctor, they would have all been drinking bad water and poor food. Because
Definitely.
He was very, what would I say? Sorry? He made it clear that he was on the expedition as a physiologist more than a doctor. And to make sure that people were safe and sound in camp rather than on the mountain itself. If you read his daughter's book biography, you'll get an insight into his life. I think he's the one who developed the Duke of Edinburgh Awards after the 1953.
That's really interesting, thank you.
Griff Pugh, he was of poor background as well, but he managed to worm his way in because he married into a stately family.
Oh, right, okay.
And he got onto the 53 expedition because of that fact alone. He was more or less shunned by the rest because of his poverty. But as far as skill he was at the top.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you very much.
Anyone else have any questions in the back? And I'll come to
Just a matter of interest. Don, what's his surname? Don Miller lived and died in Belmont.
Did he? Oh, okay.
I was vicar at the time, and I actually took his funeral service.
Oh, right, okay. Great, thank you very much. There's a great connection to the area then.
And the gentleman in the back, you had a question?
Just a social comment. I have read that George and Ashley Abraham were not allowed to join the Alpine Club because of two sins. One was they were in trade, they actually kept a shop, and the other was they were Jewish. And the climate clubs formed as a direct consequence of it because there were less rock climbers around. And a guy called O.G. Jones, the only genuine Jones, was instrumental in forming the climate club so they could join.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, there's so many different threads that can be covered. But yeah, that's a really good point about the exclusion that led to the Climbers Club, and then what led to the Pinnacle Club as well.
Does anyone have any other questions?
Might be slightly beyond your 20th century focus, but the one my thoughts were is you described a lot about different social structures, excluding things like that. What thoughts in terms of changes that kind of social media and other things has now brought in terms of mountains, both in terms of opening up access, but also potential safety issues?
That's a really good point, and I think even though my research looks at the 20th century, it's important to put it in the context of what has happened since, because what we're talking about how that culture has got to the point it has, which has obviously meant, like, I mentioned it really briefly, but like a mass outdoor movement of people visiting Eddie. It's now sort of reaching at times a sort of critical point where the local area can't many times cope with it. And I think your point about social media, that's definitely influential in that. It's kind of that narrative, that literature sort of approach, but amplified to like anyone basically, which definitely encourages people here, and can often cause issues, especially when it comes to more sort of technical rock climbing. It can encourage people to go and do things that are far beyond their capabilities and get into some pretty nasty scrapes. So thank you.
Did anybody here know Joe Brown?
Yeah, I do.
I had a feeling some people would.
And did you visit, were you visitors to his cafe and his
shop?
Shop?
I used to climb them.
Really? Oh, brilliant.
I went to his shop to buy rock climbing harness. I was contemplating which one, and I noticed one had the brand Joe Brown. And the man came up and said, "Can I help?" And I said, "Well, I didn't know Joe Brown made rock climbing harnesses." And he said, "Well, I don't know them personally."
It doesn't make every single one by hand. No, that's brilliant. Thank you.
Gentlemen.
Your Clockwin guide and
Yeah.
Peter Crew's name.
Yes, Peter Crew is a really important person.
Crew? No? Right, Peter Crew, as you referenced now, was a major Clockwin man.
Yeah.
Joe Brown man, And Peter turned his back on climbing.
Yeah.
Went to Bangor University like you to do his first degree as a moderately mature man, and ended up as the National Park's first archaeologist. And please correct me now, he passed away last year. Yes, well into his late 70s, but he going back to your journey with what is this business of here's a rock, why are you climbing it?
Yeah.
And what did Mallory say about the big mountain? Because it's there.
Yeah.
So it so happens I knew him fairly well, and I worked with him as an archaeologist. He turned that intensity of hard rock thinking, yes, and physicality into his archaeology, one of the most celebrated or not celebrated in a certain, fancy way. So then he's a great loss, and it's interesting, how the physicality and the ideology and the philosophy of hard rock climbing was turned into one of the best archaeologists that we've had of that age. So great loss losing Peter. And he was he Manchester too?
I think he might have been from Sheffield, because there was a group of climbers, especially in the 60s and into the 70s, it was very much a group from Sheffield University,
so then
and that area.
He was a hard rock man, and was he a hard archaeologist?
Yeah.
And I say that positively.
That's so brilliant, thanks for that story.
And, do chase him down. I think he's had enough respect. And I also spotted you, Jim Perrin, yes?
Yes.
Another dangerous man, I'd say.
Yeah.
Again, as you've been very generous with what to chase next when we is Jim Perrin's, he's got a trio of books by Gwas Gomer. One is the orange one on Snowdon in the Mountains, that we know.
Yeah, Snowdon's the orange one, the blue one is about Eddie.
And take a stiff cup of coffee before you read it, because it doesn't take hostages, and that's important in a critical book like his. Jim Perrin's Snowdonia.
Definitely. Jim Perrin does a lot of biographies Jim Perrin's done a lot of biographies as well as different people that I've mentioned, which are really good writing as well. There's a lot of stuff online as well, in different forums, and there's a whole network of sort of people who were contemporaries of the history and there at the time, and like you mentioned, had connections to people like Peter, and then also sort of more modern enthusiasts of that era, because it resonates so much about how basically crazy a lot of these people were to do what they did at that time and with the equipment that they had. So yeah, thank you.
Do we have any more questions from anybody?
Just one about Joe Brown.
Yeah.
I was working in Norway in the late 70s, early 80s. We noticed Joe Brown painting in front of the shop in Canberras. And what he was stood on was not, even to health and safety standards of the day, it was not safe enough. He survived.
Yeah. That's brilliant, thank you.
Anyone else? Any questions or any little stories they want to share? Yes.
A little factoid about Don Williams. Reading University Mountaineering Club, we invited him to give a talk.
I've heard of this, yeah.
About 72 or so, 69, and it turned out a big bandage all over his head. What was a heroic story there? And he'd been pissed.
Yeah.
And walked into a lamppost.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have we finished with questions? Well, can we show our appreciation? That was such a lovely...
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Now, we do have a raffle.
Okay.
And it's always up to the speaker to pick the raffle
Brilliant.
tickets out.
The power in my hands.
I think one of the raffle prizes is walking in Snowdonia, isn't it? Climbing in Snowdonia.
Oh, brilliant. Okay.
Close your eyes, otherwise you might pick a favourite colour.
Okay.
Just one.
There we go. Okay, so...
There are 3 prizes, so if you wouldn't mind doing it.
Okay. So the first prize is number 391.
Green.
Green. Sorry.
Did you, Susan, was it yours? Yeah, there we are, that's wonderful.
Well done.
I haven't I got it on? Oh no, sorry.
Thank you.
The green one.
So we've got number 376. Hey, well done.
Apologies to anybody that bought a white ticket.
Better odds than the lottery though, I suppose. Okay, we've got number 395.
That's me again, so...
Oh, right, okay. Let's pick a white one then. Okie dokie. So white one, number 380. Hey, well done.
Okay, thank you very much.
There you go.
Next talk, the last talk of this season, is on the 15th of April, and Arwin Owen, who's been here before, he's an archaeologist, but this time he's going to talk to us on some new research that he's been doing into Vikings in North Wales. You don't have to dress up to come. Thank you very much indeed,
Thank you.
George.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.